The courtroom was already full before the judge even arrived, and every single seat was taken by reporters, lawyers, office workers, and curious strangers who had come only to watch the fall of a famous billionaire, Emma Carter. A woman known not only for her wealth but also for her strong will and quiet kindness. And now she stood alone at the front of the room in a soft gray business suit that once showed her power, but today only showed how tired and afraid she felt. Her hands slightly shaking as she held onto the wooden table in front of her, while the low sound of whispers moved through the crowd like a cold wind. People leaning toward each other and speaking in soft voices, asking how such a rich and respected woman could end up here, wondering if the stories were true, wondering if she was really a criminal or just another rich person caught in a dark game. And Emma tried hard not to look at them, because every stare felt like a sharp needle. Every whisper felt like a stone being thrown at her heart. And when she finally lifted her eyes, she saw her lawyer sitting beside her. A man who had promised to protect her and fight for her truth. A man she had trusted with her future. But today, something was different in his face. He looked nervous, his hands kept moving, and he could not look directly at her. And then slowly he leaned closer and spoke in a very low voice, telling her words that made her entire body go cold. Words that sounded like the end of everything. And her eyes widened in fear as she searched his face for an answer. For hope, for any sign that he was still on her side. But there was nothing, only worry and shame. And before she could even ask him what he meant, he suddenly stood up, his chair making a loud sound that echoed in the silent room, causing everyone to turn and look. And the judge raised his eyes from the papers in front of him, and the lawyer spoke in a clear but shaky voice, telling the judge that he could no longer represent this client, that he was stepping down from the case. And the moment those words left his mouth, a wave of shock moved across the courtroom. People gasped, some covered their mouths. Others quickly started texting, cameras flashing even faster, capturing Emma's pale face and the look of confusion and pain that she could no longer hide. And before anyone could stop him, the lawyer picked up his expensive bag, turned away from her, and walked straight toward the large wooden doors. And with one push, he left, the doors closing behind him with a heavy sound that felt like a final goodbye. And Emma was left standing there alone before the judge, without a voice to defend her, without a shield against the many hungry eyes that now stared at her as if she was already guilty. And the judge's voice echoed through the room as he said that without a lawyer, the court could go on without proper defense. And those words fell on Emma like rain in a storm, cold and endless, and she slowly turned around, her eyes searching the faces of the people she once called friends, the people who once smiled beside her at parties and meetings, the people who all used her name with pride, but now none of them stepped forward. None of them moved, not her business partners, not her assistants, not even the distant family members who sat with stiff faces. All of them silent, all of them looking away as if she no longer existed. And in that moment she felt not like a billionaire, but like the poorest and loneliest person in the world, standing in the middle of a room full of strangers, with her future hanging in the air. And just when it seemed that the silence would break her completely, the camera of the story moved to the very back of the courtroom, where a quiet man in a simple blue janitor uniform stood holding a mop, his cart beside him, his face calm while everyone else was filled with fear or excitement. A man no one had noticed before because he blended into the walls like a shadow, and yet he had been watching everything, listening to every word. And as he looked at Emma, he did not see a rich woman or a famous name. He only saw a human being about to be crushed by lies. And something inside him would not stay silent anymore, so slowly. While the crowd still whispered and the judge waited for order, the janitor lifted his hand high into the air. and his small motion brought a sudden quiet to the entire room. And one by one, heads began to turn, eyes growing wide as they realized who had raised his hand. A simple janitor in the back of the court, and in a clear and steady voice that surprised even himself. He spoke words that no one expected to hear that day, saying that he would stand for her, that he would speak for her, that he would not let an innocent person be judged without a voice. And the entire courtroom froze, the judge staring in confusion, the reporters lowering their phones in disbelief, and Emma slowly turning around to look at the man who had just changed the direction of her future, her eyes full of confusion and a tiny spark of hope. And in that silent moment, no one yet knew that this simple janitor, with a mop in his hand and courage in his heart, was about to begin the most shocking and powerful fight the courtroom had ever seen. When the janitor's words filled the courtroom, a strange silence followed, the kind of silence that feels louder than shouting. And one by one, people turned fully in their seats to see who had spoken, their eyes moving from the front of the room to the back, where the man in the simple blue uniform stood with his hand still raised. And whispers quickly returned, but this time they were full of laughter and doubt. People asking who this man thought he was, how a janitor could even speak in such a serious place. And some even smiled as if they were watching a bad joke. Yet the man did not laugh. He did not lower his head. His face stayed calm, his back straight, and his eyes steady as he looked toward the judge, who now leaned forward with a confused and careful expression. And the judge asked him who he was and why he had raised his hand in a court of law. And the man answered in a quiet but clear voice that his name was Daniel, that he was a janitor in this building, and that he had no power or title, but he believed that the woman standing alone at the front of the room was not guilty. And when he said those words, people began to laugh again, some shaking their heads as if feeling sorry for his foolish courage. But the judge held up his hand and ordered the room to remain silent. And then he asked Daniel a simple question, asking how he could know such a thing. And for the first time, a small shadow of emotion crossed the man's face, not fear, but memory. And he looked down for a moment at the worn floor tiles that he had cleaned many times before lifting his eyes again and explaining that every night he worked, while the world slept, that he pushed his cart through dark hallways, empty offices, and silent meeting rooms, and that he saw more than people thought, because no one ever paid attention to the man with the mop. And in that invisible space, he heard voices, saw papers, and noticed strange actions. And he explained that 2 nights before the arrest of Emma Carter, while he was cleaning near a private office in the building, he saw 2 men standing outside the door in low light, their faces hidden by shadows, their voices low and tense. And though he did not know their names at that time, he could feel that something was wrong by the way they kept looking around as if afraid of being seen. And he said that he remembered one of them holding a thick brown folder, tapping it nervously against his leg, and even though he tried to stay out of trouble, something inside him told him to remember that moment, to remember those figures. And then later that night, after the building had fallen silent once again, he entered the same office to clean the floor. And on the desk, he saw documents spread out carelessly, documents that seemed important. And though he could not understand all the words at first glance, he understood enough to see the name Emma Carter written again and again. And when the news of her arrest filled the building the next morning, a deep feeling of unease settled in his chest, because the papers he had seen the night before looked fresh, as if they had just been written. And he knew in his heart that something about this case was wrong. And as Daniel spoke, Emma stood as still as a statue, her heart beating fast within her chest, her eyes never leaving the man who was telling the court of some hidden night she never knew existed. And for the first time since this terrible moment began, she felt a small, fragile thread of hope starting to grow inside her. But the people who had accused her were now no longer sitting so comfortably, their hands tightening, their eyes flickering, and one of them even stood up suddenly and shouted that this man was lying, that he was wasting the court's time. But Daniel did not stop speaking, and he told the judge that while cleaning later that same evening, he found a torn piece of paper in a trash bin near the office, and something about it made him keep it instead of throwing it away. And he slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out that small folded piece, holding it up for the judge to see, and the entire room leaned forward, breath held, phones rising once again, as if all of them sensed that something important was about to be revealed. And the judge's eyes narrowed as he looked at the paper, his fingers tapping slowly on the desk, and he asked the guard to bring it to him. And as the piece of paper was carried to the front, Emma felt as if time itself had stopped, because on that small torn page might be the difference between freedom and ruin. And while the room stayed frozen in suspense, Daniel lowered his hand, but not his courage, standing quietly again with his mop beside him, waiting, knowing that from this moment on, nothing in this courtroom would ever be the same. The guard carefully carried the torn piece of paper to the judge as if it was something fragile and dangerous, and every sound in the courtroom seemed to grow louder in the deep silence that followed. The soft echo of shoes on the floor, the light cough of someone in the back, the quiet clicking of cameras as reporters tried to capture the exact second when everything might change. And Emma's eyes followed the guard's hand with fear and hope mixed together like a storm in her chest, because that small paper now held more power over her life than all her wealth ever had. And when the judge finally took the piece and looked at it closely, his face changed from simple curiosity to serious focus, his eyebrows drawing together as he read the words written on it. And the room waited, every breath held, every heart beating fast. And then the judge raised his eyes slowly and looked toward the men who had accused Emma, and his stare made them shift in their seats, their confidence now beginning to crack like thin glass. And he asked the court clerk to read aloud what the paper said. And as the clerk's voice filled the room, the meaning became clear to everyone, because the paper was part of a bigger document, a secret agreement listing several company names, bank numbers, and planned actions. But one thing stood out more than anything else, because Emma's name was written in a different ink, a darker and newer color, as if it had been added later, and her signature was printed beside it in a way that looked forced and unnatural. And a wave of shock moved through the crowd again as people started whispering more urgently, now in confusion instead of judgment, and Emma felt her legs almost give way beneath her as she realized what that meant. Because if her name had been added later, then this entire case had been built on a lie, and her chest trembled as quiet tears filled her eyes. But she refused to fall, refused to show weakness, instead lifting her face with new strength as she stared at the people who had tried to destroy her. And at the back of the room, Daniel stood silent, watching everything carefully, his face still calm, but his hands slightly tight around the mop handle, because he knew that this was only the beginning of something far bigger. And the judge then asked Daniel more questions, asking him exactly when he found this paper, exactly where, and exactly what he had seen that night. And Daniel answered patiently, explaining that the torn piece came from a document that had been ripped up quickly, thrown away without care, and that when he saw Emma's name, he had felt an instinct to save it, to keep it safe without fully knowing why. And now that simple action had turned into the most important moment of the entire trial. And while Daniel spoke, one of the men sitting at the front, a tall businessman with cold eyes and an expensive suit, began to sweat, and his hand reached up to loosen his tie as his breathing grew faster. And the judge noticed this change in his behavior, calling attention to it in a firm voice and asking the man to remain seated and calm. But the tension in the air could now be felt by everyone, And the judge then ordered the court officials to bring in the original files that had been used to charge Emma. And as they were placed on the large wooden desk before him, he began comparing them to the torn page, studying every line, every mark, every letter. And the longer he looked, the deeper the silence became, until even the reporters lowered their cameras, sensing the seriousness of the moment. And then finally the judge spoke again, slowly and clearly, stating that there was strong evidence that the documents submitted against Emma had been changed, and that part of it had most likely been added at a later time. And a loud murmur ran through the courtroom, and the people who once whispered that Emma was guilty now looked at one another in doubt. And Emma felt a sudden rush of emotion, not just relief, but pain for everything she had already lost because of the false accusations. Her reputation, her peace, her sleep, her trust. And in that moment she realized how fast the world could turn against someone without listening to the truth. And still the judge was not finished, because he now asked for surveillance footage from the hallway outside the office where Daniel had been working that night. And this request sent a clear message that the court now believed his words. And as the officers left to retrieve the footage, the man who had been sweating suddenly stood up, trying to say that this was all unnecessary, that time was being wasted. But the judge's voice cut through the room like thunder as he demanded order. And Emma watched the fear now rising in the men who had once stood so proudly against her, and she realized that for the first time, power was no longer sitting on their side of the room, but slowly, carefully, moving toward the lonely janitor in the back and the silent woman at the front. And as the doors closed behind the officers who went to get the video, the courtroom once again fell into waiting silence, a silence filled with tension, because everyone knew that when those screens turned on, the truth would no longer have any place to hide. The officers returned with the security footage, carrying a small black box that looked ordinary, but the people in the courtroom knew it held the key to everything. And as the judge connected it to the large screen above his desk, the lights dimmed slightly, the room leaning into a tense silence that felt heavier than any weight Emma had carried before. And when the first frames appeared, the faces of everyone in the room went pale, because there, on the screen, was the hallway outside the private office where Daniel had seen the suspicious men. And the camera clearly showed two figures in the dim light, one tall, one shorter, moving quickly as they carried papers and whispered to each other, glancing over their shoulders as if afraid of being caught. And the longer the footage played, the more obvious it became that these men were not ordinary employees, but people with authority, dressed in expensive suits and speaking in a manner that suggested importance and urgency. And then the camera turned briefly to a corner where Daniel had been cleaning that night, barely visible in the shadow, his mop leaning against the wall, unseen by the men, but he had witnessed every move. And the court now saw it too, proving that Daniel's words had been true. And the judge paused the video, leaning forward, squinting at the screen, asking the men at the front if they recognized themselves. And suddenly, the room erupted in whispers. Some people gasping, some pointing, and the tall businessman, who had been sweating and trying to appear calm, turned red with anger and fear, his hand shaking as he gripped the edge of the desk. And his partner, the shorter man, swallowed hard, unable to meet anyone's eyes, knowing that their carefully constructed plan was falling apart in front of everyone. And reporters quickly typed and whispered, realizing that this footage could destroy careers, reputations, and fortunes. All because a simple janitor had dared to notice something unusual. And Emma felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief, tears forming at the corners of her eyes as she realized that the moment she thought she was completely alone, someone had been quietly fighting for her without asking for anything in return. And the judge finally spoke, his voice firm and commanding, stating that the video evidence strongly suggested that the documents used to accuse Emma had been tampered with, that the two men in the footage were directly responsible for placing falsified papers in the office, and that their actions had caused severe harm to an innocent person, and the courtroom shifted uneasily, as people who had once judged Emma now stared at the criminals in shock, some whispering that power and money could not protect people from truth forever. And the lawyers who had once looked down on Daniel now leaned forward, realizing that the quiet janitor had exposed a conspiracy far bigger than anyone had imagined. And one of the men tried to speak, to deny everything, to claim that the footage was fake or manipulated. But the judge interrupted sharply, demanding evidence for any claim. And the man fell silent, realizing he had no proof. And the shorter man, sweating heavily, began to mutter apologies that no one listened to. And then the judge turned to Emma, asking if she wished to speak. And for the first time since the trial began, she felt her voice return, trembling but strong. And she told the court that she had been accused unfairly, that she had trusted the system to protect her, and that a simple man who worked quietly, without recognition or title, had given her the courage to face everything. And as she spoke, the room felt a shift, a change in energy, as if the walls themselves had witnessed the truth and now bowed to it. And Daniel stood silently behind her, his eyes never leaving hers, feeling pride not for himself but for the fact that justice could finally begin. And as the judge continued reviewing the footage, he called the security officers to check other cameras to see if more evidence could confirm what had been seen. And as they played different angles, the courtroom saw more of the men's suspicious behavior. Carrying papers, meeting secretly, hiding folders. And one frame even caught the taller man glancing at Emma's office and smiling in a way that suggested premeditation. And the whispers in the courtroom grew louder, some people gasping that someone so rich and powerful could be trapped in such a deceitful plan, while others leaned back in shock, realizing how much they had underestimated the quiet janitor. And the judge's gavel finally hit the desk, demanding silence as he said that the evidence clearly indicated a deliberate attempt to frame Emma Carter, and that the case must be reconsidered immediately. And he asked the men at the front to stand, their faces pale and rigid as the cameras focused on them, capturing their fear, capturing the moment when the powerful realized that money, influence, and authority could not protect them from truth when courage, attention, and honesty were on the other side. And Emma felt a wave of gratitude and emotion wash over her, glancing at Daniel, who smiled faintly, his job as janitor continuing, his mop still in hand. Yet in that moment, he was more than a janitor. He was a hero, the one who had noticed when no one else did. And as the courtroom murmurs grew into a roar of anticipation, the judge ordered the men to step aside as the court began documenting the evidence, reviewing their actions and preparing to hold them accountable. And reporters began typing furiously, capturing every detail, realizing that a story of greed and deceit had just been uncovered, all because a simple man dared to stand up for what was right. And in that moment, the courtroom was no longer just a place of law and rules, but a stage where truth and bravery had finally won over lies and power. And Emma, standing tall despite the weeks of fear, realized that life could turn suddenly, that heroes could come from the most unexpected places, and that even when everyone else abandoned her, courage could appear in the form of a janitor with a mop, a man who refused to stay silent. And as the judge continued his work, the powerful men at the front of the room began to understand that their fate was no longer in their hands, and that for the first time in this long, dark chapter of Emma's life, the light of justice had arrived. During the break, while the courtroom emptied for a few minutes, a young journalist approached Daniel quietly, curious about the man who had suddenly become the hero of the trial. And she asked him softly how he knew so much. How a janitor could have the courage to stand in front of a room full of powerful people and speak the truth without fear. And Daniel paused for a moment, looking down at his worn shoes, thinking of a life no one in this courtroom could imagine, because few knew that behind the simple uniform and mop, he had once been a top law student, a young man with bright eyes, full of dreams, walking through university halls with books in his hands, hoping to become a lawyer who could defend the helpless and fight for justice. But life had other plans, cruel and unkind. And one night, a terrible accident had taken everything from his parents gone, his home gone, his dreams crushed under the weight of loss, and forced him to leave his studies behind, leaving him with nothing but memories and the skills he had learned. And to survive, he had taken a simple job in the very building where Emma now stood, cleaning floors, emptying trash, and pushing a mop through hallways. Yet despite all the hardship, he had never forgotten the law he had studied, never forgotten the sense of right and wrong. And every night while he worked, he observed, he listened. He noticed small details that others ignored, and he stored them in his mind, like puzzle pieces waiting to make sense. And when he had seen those two men with the papers and later found the torn page, his years of knowledge and his quiet attention told him that something terrible was about to happen. And he could not stay silent, because staying silent meant letting injustice win. And now, speaking to the journalist, he admitted that he had never expected recognition, never expected thanks, because his only purpose was to do what was right. And as he told his story, Emma watched from across the room, sitting quietly in a corner, her heart filling with a mix of admiration, gratitude, and wonder, because she realized that the man who had just saved her was no ordinary janitor, but someone whose life had been shaped by tragedy and determination, someone who had turned pain into purpose. And in that moment, she understood that courage did not always come from wealth, power, or titles, but sometimes from quiet hearts that refused to give up. And as Daniel finished speaking, a small smile crossed his face, humble yet proud, and Emma felt a lump in her throat as tears began to fill her eyes, because she had been saved by a man who had nothing in the eyes of the world, yet everything in spirit. And in the courtroom, the people who had watched in disbelief began to understand, some whispering, some staring, realizing that the janitor's knowledge, his calm, and his bravery had changed the entire case, that he had not only observed, but acted, putting himself in the middle of danger simply to do what was right. And the judge, having returned from the short break, now looked at Daniel with a new respect, no longer seeing a mere custodian, but someone who had the insight and courage to stand for truth. And even the powerful men at the front, the ones who had tried to frame Emma, now looked nervous, their confident faces replaced by fear, because this quiet man, once ignored by everyone, had exposed their lies and now held the attention of the court, the press, and the judge. And as the courtroom prepared to continue, Emma rose slowly from her chair, walking toward Daniel, feeling the weight of gratitude heavier than any gold she had ever owned. And she whispered softly, so no one else could hear, "I don't know how to thank you." And Daniel simply smiled, shaking his head, telling her that no thanks were needed, that he only did what any person should do. And yet, in that simple gesture, the room seemed to glow with a new sense of hope, because everyone could feel that this moment was bigger than just a trial, bigger than just Emma Carter, bigger than wealth or power. It was a story about courage, truth, and the quiet hero who had refused to stay invisible. And as Emma returned to her seat, the judge cleared his throat and began speaking again, explaining that with the new information provided by Daniel, the court would examine all evidence carefully. And for the first time, it seemed as if justice had a chance to be served. And Emma looked back at Daniel one more time, noticing the small details, the worn mop handle, the simple blue uniform, the calm determination in his eyes, and she realized that he had been standing for her, not for money, not for fame, but for justice. And in that realization, she understood that life could be changed by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And as the courtroom filled with tension once again, all eyes on the judge, all ears listening, Emma felt a strange peace inside her, because no matter what came next, she knew she had someone who truly believed in her, someone whose courage had begun to turn the tide. And in that moment, Daniel, the man no one had noticed before, was no longer just a janitor. He was a symbol of truth, hope, and bravery in the courtroom filled with whispers, gasps, and flashing cameras seemed to recognize it too, because the story of a billionaire saved by a janitor was a story no one would ever forget. The courtroom fell silent once more as the judge returned to his desk, the torn piece of paper still lying in front of him. The security footage now paused on the screen, and every person in the room holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Because the evidence Daniel had provided was not only strong, it was undeniable. And the tension was so thick that even the reporters stopped typing for a moment, their cameras lowered as they tried to capture the intensity of the moment. And the judge began speaking slowly, his voice carrying authority, stating that based on the new evidence, including the torn page and the security footage, it was clear that Emma Carter had been falsely accused, and that the documents used to charge her had been deliberately altered and manipulated. And as he continued, he described how the two men seen on the footage had intentionally tried to frame her, how their actions had placed her life, reputation, and freedom in grave danger. And the murmurs in the room grew louder, some whispering in shock, others nodding in agreement. And the businessmen who had plotted against her now looked pale, their confident faces replaced by fear, because their plan, carefully built over months, was falling apart before their eyes, and the judge called them forward, asking for their explanation, but neither could answer, stuttering and shifting nervously in their seats. And as the courtroom cameras focused on them, the journalists quickly noted every detail, every sign of guilt, because the world was about to see the truth unfold. And Emma, standing beside Daniel, felt a wave of relief crash over her, tears filling her eyes as she realized that she was no longer alone, that someone had truly fought for her, and that finally, justice was within reach. And the judge then announced that the charges against Emma Carter were dropped immediately, that she was to be released from all accusations, and that the men responsible for falsifying the evidence would face legal consequences for their actions. And the room erupted into shocked whispers, some gasps, and a few claps as the weight of the moment settled on everyone present. And Emma slowly turned toward Daniel, her eyes full of gratitude, her lips trembling as she whispered, "You saved my life." And Daniel, still calm but with a faint smile, shook his head, telling her that he had only done what was right, that he could not watch injustice go unchecked. And for a moment the room seemed to pause, as if recognizing that the bravery of one simple janitor had changed the course of history in that courtroom. And the powerful men, now exposed and powerless, were escorted out by the officers, their faces pale, their bodies stiff, as they realized that wealth and influence could not protect them from the truth when someone had the courage to act. And reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing. Capturing the moment, Emma stepped away from the table and walked to Daniel, her hand reaching out to shake his, and she thanked him again, her voice steady now with a mix of emotion and relief. And Daniel simply nodded, humbly acknowledging that he had only done what anyone with a conscience would have done. And the crowd in the courtroom began to cheer quietly at first, then louder, a wave of approval and astonishment spreading as people recognized that something extraordinary had occurred, that the quiet man who cleaned floors every night had become the hero of the day. And as Emma returned to her seat, the judge continued, explaining that the court would ensure a full investigation of the men who had plotted against her, that all falsified evidence would be officially removed from records, and that the integrity of the legal system must be maintained. And as his words echoed through the room, Emma could finally breathe, feeling the fear and pressure that had built for weeks slowly leaving her body, replaced by hope and a renewed sense of life. And she glanced at Daniel one more time, noticing the simple details, the worn uniform, the mop leaning against the wall, the calm determination in his eyes, and realized that heroism did not always wear a suit or carry a title. Sometimes it came in quiet forms, in ordinary people who refused to stand aside when someone needed help. And the journalists now surrounded Daniel, asking questions, wanting to tell the story of the janitor who saved a billionaire, while cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing the humility, courage, and focus of a man who had changed everything without seeking attention. And as the room slowly emptied, the court staff packing up their papers, the lawyers leaving in silence, and the reporters preparing their stories, Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a feeling she had not known for weeks. A feeling that told her that justice had finally been served, and that one person's courage, no matter how small or unnoticed before, could tip the balance between ruin and redemption. And outside the courtroom, people who had watched the story unfold on live streams whispered about the janitor who had done what no one else could. And Emma smiled softly to herself, knowing that life had given her a second chance, that the darkness she had faced had been pierced by a quiet light, and that Daniel, the man with nothing to gain and everything to risk, had given her the most valuable gift of all: freedom, truth, and hope. And as she walked out of the courtroom, Daniel following quietly behind, she realized that sometimes the greatest heroes were those who never sought to be heroes at all, but simply stood up when it mattered the most. And that lesson, more than anything else, would stay with her forever. Days after the trial, life slowly returned to its usual rhythm for the people around Emma Carter. But for her, nothing felt usual anymore, because the experience had changed her in ways she could not have imagined. And she spent hours reflecting on how quickly fortune and power could vanish, how fragile trust could be, and how courage could appear in the most unexpected forms. And every time she thought of Daniel, the quiet janitor who had saved her in the courtroom, she felt a deep mix of gratitude and admiration, because he had not sought fame, he had not asked for money, he had not even announced himself as a hero. Yet he had done the most extraordinary thing anyone could do. He had stood for truth, for justice, and for her, when no one else would. And one morning, Emma decided to visit the building where it had all happened, walking through the familiar halls, hearing the echo of her own footsteps, remembering the fear and tension, the silent whispers and the flashing cameras. And finally, she arrived at the spot where Daniel was quietly working, mop in hand, moving slowly across the shiny floor, pushing it back and forth with precision and care, unaware that the woman whose life he had saved now watched him with quiet admiration. And she called his name softly, Daniel, and he looked up, slightly surprised but smiling faintly, acknowledging her presence. And Emma stepped closer, noticing the worn uniform, the tired but steady eyes, and the humble way he carried himself. And she spoke carefully, her voice filled with emotion, telling him that she could not stop thinking about what he had done, that she knew he had risked everything to help her, and that his courage had changed her life forever. And Daniel shook his head, telling her that he had done nothing extraordinary, that he had only done what he felt was right, that anyone in his place would have acted the same. And Emma smiled softly, but she shook her head gently, telling him that no one else would have, that most people would have looked away. And then she paused, thinking deeply, realizing what she wanted to offer him, because she knew that a man like Daniel, with his knowledge, integrity, and courage, should not remain unnoticed, should not be limited to cleaning floors while the world continued unaware of his true abilities. And so she offered him a position in her company, not as a janitor, but as her personal legal advisor, a role that would allow him to use his skill, intelligence, and knowledge of law to help others. And Daniel's eyes widened, surprise and disbelief crossing his face, because he had never imagined such an offer, had never thought that the woman he had helped would now offer him a life-changing opportunity. And he took a deep breath, considering the offer, thinking about the years he had spent cleaning holes, watching and learning. And he realized that this was a chance to continue helping people. Not just Emma, but others who might face injustice. And finally he nodded, quietly accepting, telling her that he would do his best, that he would continue to serve truth and justice with the same courage he had in the courtroom. And Emma smiled, feeling a sense of joy and peace she had not known for weeks, knowing that not only was she free, but that Daniel, the man who had saved her, would now have the opportunity to shine in the way he deserved, and together they left the building, walking side by side, talking quietly, planning for the future. And the world outside continued as usual, unaware that they were witnessing a new beginning for two people whose lives have been forever intertwined by courage, truth, and hope. And Emma could not help but look at Daniel with a renewed sense of respect, realizing that true heroism often comes from those who are least noticed. And Daniel, for his part, felt a quiet pride, knowing that he had not only helped save a life, but had also been given a chance to continue making a difference. And as they stepped into the sunlight, the weight of fear and tension lifted completely, replaced by a sense of freedom, trust, and new possibilities. And Emma thought about how fragile and precious life was, how quickly everything could change.